Oil prices threaten Iraq's recovery, border battles over the new year, and the media has its panties in a wad over Brazil's new president. We'll break it all down here in 15 minutes on The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey everybody, I'm Chuck Holton. It's Thursday, the 3rd of January, and the new year is already off to a great start. Two presidents took office in Latin America, in Mexico and Brazil, and they're pursuing two radically different agendas. In Brazil, former paratrooper Jair Bolsonaro was inaugurated Monday and is immediately ready to make a decree that will make it easier for Brazilian citizens to protect themselves with a firearm. He's also committing his administration to eradicating what he calls the marxist influences from Brazilian government and academia. All this is causing the liberal media to practically set their hair on fire. The Huffington Post is running an article which claims that democracy has failed in Brazil, even though the elections there were free and fair and there are no claims otherwise. Now, Brazil has suffered under Marxist ideology before. Its recent left-wing president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is currently serving a 12-year prison sentence for corruption. And under his administration, the government pursued the policy we see so often from the left of making its citizens more vulnerable and then trying to convince them that doing so makes them safer. Under Lula's administration, hundreds of thousands of legally purchased guns were confiscated and destroyed, which left only criminals armed and led to one of the highest murder rates outside of an active war zone anywhere on the planet. Gangs took over the poor communities called favelas and extracted a terrible price on the people who lived there. Medical clinics closed in many communities because the streets were just too violent for doctors to even get to work, and tourism has suffered greatly. Now, I visited Rio de Janeiro last April, and this is what I found.
Hey, Chuck Holton here. You know, they say war is hell, but somebody's got to go to Rio de Janeiro, and dadgummit, that's me. I'm here suffering for you to bring you the news from Brazil this week, and I'm standing here on this completely deserted white sand beach. Well, it's not exactly deserted. There's that guy running in a Speedo right there, but voila. Other than that guy, it's a completely deserted beach. And, you know, that says something about the tourism industry here in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, this beach should have thousands of tourists on it right now. It's a perfect day out here. And there's nobody here except that guy. Part of the reason that there's nobody here is because the crime has spiked so badly over the last year or two that they say that the tourism industry in Brazil lost $1 billion last year. And a large part of that is attributable directly to that spike in crime and violence. So the government is trying to figure out what to do about that. They've sent the military now into the worst neighborhoods, the favelas around the edges of Rio de Janeiro, to try to pacify them, try to take them back from the drug dealers and the criminal warlords that are controlling those areas. But until they get a handle on it, it's good for me because I get this whole beach essentially to myself. But it's not very good for the economy of Rio de Janeiro, this city of 6 million people. That's a bad thing. And that kind of poverty is certainly not going to make the crime rate get any better either.
Brazil was really the poster child for all the restrictions on private gun ownership that are routinely called for here in the United States. All those, common sense gun laws like universal background checks, age restrictions, standard capacity magazine bans, and high taxes on ammunition failed to stop the bloodbath that's become the daily norm on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Now Brazilian citizens have been rushing to get firearms training in anticipation of finally being able to protect their families from the out-of-control crime in their neighborhoods. But they're going to need some new gun ranges and some new guns. I visited a gun range outside of Rio de Janeiro when I was there, and here's what that looked like. Okay, we're here today at a gun range about an hour outside of Rio City, and I'm here with the owner, Hugo. Okay. Right? He's a former Navy guy from here in Brazil, 31
31 anos.
31 years in the Navy. He's now a pistol instructor, and he's showing us some of the guns they've got here at the gun store and at the indoor range, as you can see. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that you can see how well used these guns are, and that's because it's just so hard to get a gun, and so these guns are only a few years old, but they get tons and tons of use. How much would this gun cost?
Essa arma aqui está aproximadamente 5.000, 5.500 reais.
So you're saying 5,500 reals, that's about $1,800 for a .380 caliber. It looks like a 1911 Colt, but it's actually made in .380. It's built here locally in Brazil. And how much would the Glock cost?
Quanto é essa aqui? Mais ou menos, aqui no Brasil, aproximadamente 6.000 reais.
Okay, so it's about $2,000 for this Glock 25. Is that 25?
25. G25.
Yeah, Glock 25. And so it just goes to show how truly difficult it is to get a gun, because you can imagine if you're the single mother who has an ex-spouse that's coming after you or threatening you, to be able to spend what would amount to 6 months' pay on a firearm, not to mention the bureaucracy and the difficulty that you have to go through to even get a permit to own it. And then if you do get the permit to own it, you're not allowed to carry it anywhere, only keep it in your house. You can tell why that makes it very difficult for people here in Brazil.
Poxa, você não tem ideia de como é difícil.
Yeah,
Muito difícil.
Yeah, he says it's very hard.
Now, one would hope that once President Bolsonaro loosens restrictions on gun ownership in Brazil, he'll also make it easier for guns to be imported, because the high cost of guns in circulation means that currently guns are sort of a rich man's sport. That is, only people with plenty of disposable income can afford to purchase one. Now, whether or not that was the intent of the previous administrations, the upshot is that the people who most need self-protection, single mothers and people who live in poor neighborhoods, are least able to get a gun for self-defense. Now, one interesting side note to that is that one of the architects of Brazil's failed gun confiscation scheme was a guy named Pedro Abramovich, who served as the Brazilian Minister of Justice under the corrupt administration of Lula da Silva. It's worth pointing out that Abramovich's new job is working for none other than George Soros, the liberal billionaire financier whose Open Society Foundation funds lots of left-wing causes, from unfettered migration to gun control here in the United States. Now, President Bolsonaro is committed to eradicating the Marxist influence from Brazilian society. But those Marxists aren't going away. Instead, they just appear to be, at least in some sense, setting their sights on the United States and other countries here in the Western Hemisphere. All right, now let's turn to Mexico. Their new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is a mirror image to Jair Bolsonaro. He's also a populist, but on the other side of the spectrum. They call him AMLO, and he's the first leftist president in Mexico for the last 70 years. He ran on a platform of pro-migrant, raise the minimum wage, and going easier on criminals accused of drug trafficking. Now, from what I understand about Mexican politics, that last one might just be why he was allowed to win. There are lots of experts who believe the Mexican government is in reality just an arm of the drug cartels. At any rate, AMLO has his hands full with tens of thousands of Central American migrants camped out both on his southern border and on his northern border. Now, on New Year's Eve, there was a different kind of fireworks in Tijuana as another group of migrants tried to cross the fence illegally into the U.S. and then threw rocks at Border Patrol agents when they were unsuccessful. The Border Patrol then used tear gas and pepper balls to discourage those rock throwers, and a good time was had by all. Now, if you ask me, I think the Border Patrol ought to sell tickets to these events. I mean, like hunting permits, only with pepper balls. I know a bunch of good old boys in West Virginia who'd pay good money to go to the border and play tag with Honduran migrants trying to enter the country illegally. I'm not advocating injuring anyone, but paintballs with a little extra zip sounds like a good, clean fun to me, and maybe it'd help pay for the wall. Now, in all seriousness, It's a really unfortunate situation these migrants find themselves in. I mean, I traveled with them for a couple of days, and most of them were sold on the idea that it'd be an easy thing for them to hop the fence into the United States and get a job paying $15 an hour. A lot more people would probably choose to go back home if it wasn't being made easier to get to the United States by a lot of well-meaning groups who are helping these migrants. And we can know one thing for sure, and that is that there'll be a lot more caravans behind this one, and many of them might be made up of the guys that are filling up this restaurant over here, who are from Nepal and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Africa and all over the world, because everybody is ready to take advantage of the infrastructure being created by this caravan. And so we have to think hard about how we're going to help these people, but also help ourselves. There were many Christians who helped this group on the way, and without their help, these migrants would not have made it to the U.S. southern border. This is why I believe Christians especially need to be very thoughtful about who we help and how we employ that help, because we've got to ask ourselves whether it's actually loving to help someone do something that will likely break up their families, maybe cause their children to die on a dangerous trek, and in the end, facilitate somebody breaking the law. I don't believe that's loving, and sometimes love has to be tough. Okay, lastly, real quick, let's talk about the Middle East. Iraq is slowly trying to recover and pull out of almost 2 decades of war, and that recovery isn't going very well. Not only has the country paid a tremendous price because of the precipitous pullout of U.S. troops in 2011, which gave rise to ISIS, but now plunging oil prices have cut the government's budget by almost a quarter. So while low gasoline prices might be great for American travelers, they could lead to further instability in the Middle East and Venezuela, and even hurt the job market in Texas. Donald Trump's done a great job of encouraging job growth in the oil sector and across the U.S. by approving pipelines and making strides to help fracking take off. Most people think Saudi Arabia and Venezuela hold the largest oil reserves in the world, but the U.S. is actually number one. The problem is that most of our oil is too costly to get out of the ground at the current price. And so lower prices at the pump mean more pain is being felt by the U.S. oil industry. But while that might lead to some fracking companies laying people off or even going bankrupt, those low prices could lead to government instability in the country of Iraq, because they get more than 95% of their budget from oil revenues. And that leaves the country a whole lot more vulnerable to influences from countries like Turkey and Iran, because they can't cover even their basic budget to run the country, much less begin to address all the challenges of reconstruction after the war. I mean, right now there's some 1.8 million people in Iraq still internally displaced from their homes, and several of their major cities like Mosul have been left just in ruins. And so low oil prices, which are today below $44 a barrel, down from 75 in October, are going to be really interesting to watch what happens as they affect the rest of the world. It'll also be interesting to see how this affects 2 other hot zones, Russia and Venezuela. You might know that Russia has huge oil and natural gas reserves, but its petroleum infrastructure is in serious need of repair. And that's not going to happen with these prices. Venezuela, as you know, is already a total clown show. So maybe the silver lining here is that its government will just do everyone a favor and die more quickly now that its main source of income is really suffering. We'll see. Well, that's all for today. I'd love to get some feedback from you if you're liking the podcast. What would you like to hear more about? Should I have more guests on the show or whatever? Please like and subscribe wherever you get this podcast, and also head over to patreon.com/hotzone to subscribe and support what we're doing. We got some great things in store this year, and I look forward to sharing them with you. I'm Chuck Holton, and you're listening to The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.